The front door of our lake house swung open before I could use my key. A woman I had never seen stood in the doorway wearing my silk robe, the pale blue one I kept folded in the upstairs closet. Her hand rested casually over a very pregnant belly. She looked at me like I was the one who didn't belong there. "Oh," she said with a small laugh. "You must be Isabella." I stood frozen on the porch. For a second I thought I had the wrong house. But then I looked past her and saw my furniture. My grandmother's antique coffee table. The watercolor painting Nathan and I had chosen on our 5th anniversary. And there was my husband sitting on the couch next to baby clothes like everything was completely normal. "Bella, relax," Nathan said, rising slowly like I was the one making a scene. "Madison needs somewhere quiet before the baby arrives." This house made perfect sense. The words hit me like cold water. My husband had moved his pregnant mistress into our vacation home and said it like a decision I should simply accept. As I stepped inside, my eyes landed on the hallway desk. The drawer was slightly open. I knew exactly what was inside. And I knew something Nathan clearly didn't. He had just made the worst mistake of his life. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I picked up my car keys from the entry table and walked back out the door. The drive away felt strange. The trees along the road blurred past as my mind went back to the day we first bought that property 12 years ago. Nathan had been excited, pointing at the dock, talking about summers and fishing. The paperwork. He had never paid attention to any of that. What Nathan didn't know was that the lake house had never been ours in the usual sense. 2 years before we married, my grandmother had been very deliberate about how she organized the family's assets. She insisted the lake house be placed into a protected family trust. Her reasons were legal and practical, and at the time I was young enough to simply nod and let the lawyers handle it. Nathan had been present when I signed those documents. He sat right across from me at the attorney's table, but he had never read a single page. That night, alone in our city apartment, I pulled out the trust agreement and read every word. What I found made me sit back slowly in my chair. The next morning I called our family attorney, a sharp and calm woman named Patricia, who had handled my grandmother's estate for over a decade. I asked her to walk me through the trust document one more time. She didn't seem surprised to hear from me. "Isabella," she said carefully, "there is a clause in this trust that your grandmother was very specific about. She wanted it written in before she would agree to transfer the property." I already had the page open, but I let Patricia read it aloud. The clause stated clearly that any spouse of a trust beneficiary found guilty of marital misconduct, meaning infidelity, would automatically lose all residential access to trust-owned properties. Not partial access, all access. The moment Nathan moved Madison into that house, he had unknowingly walked straight into the condition that stripped him of any right to be there. I could call Patricia right now and have him removed within days. But I didn't. Something told me to wait. I wanted to understand exactly how far Nathan had already gone before making my move. I told Patricia to hold off but stay close. She paused on the line, then said quietly, "You already know something else, don't you?" I told her I was beginning to. I hired a private investigator named Alan 2 days later. Patricia recommended him, quiet, professional, thorough. I told him everything I knew and asked him to fill in the gaps. Within a week, Alan came back with a file that felt heavy the moment I held it. Nathan had been living a double life for almost 2 full years. It wasn't a short mistake or a moment of weakness. Madison had been a steady, deliberate part of his life since long before I had any idea. He had been paying for her apartment, her groceries, and a weekend trip to the coast, all of it funded through quiet transfers from our joint savings accounts. Each transfer was small enough to go unnoticed on its own, but the total made me feel sick. There was more. Nathan had apparently been telling friends he intended to take over the lake house permanently. He described it as the next step in his plan, like the house was simply his to hand over. I sat in Alan's office and read every page carefully. I didn't cry. The time for crying had passed. I had moved into something colder and more focused. I was documenting everything now, and I was only just beginning. Alan called me 8 days later with new information that changed everything. Nathan had been meeting privately with a real estate consultant named Frank. Their conversations, carefully documented by Alan, were about one thing: refinancing the lake house to pull out a large amount of equity. Nathan believed the property was worth well over $500,000 and planned to use that money to fund his new life with Madison and the baby. He had already requested an appraisal. He had already discussed loan figures. He was moving quickly and quietly, the same way he had been moving money from our accounts for 2 years. The problem, the very serious problem, was that Nathan had no legal ownership of that house. The property sat inside my grandmother's family trust. His name had never been on the deed. He was not an owner in any legal sense of the word. What Nathan was walking toward was financial fraud. He didn't know it yet. He thought he was making a smart business move. I put the phone down and sat very still for a long time. Then I decided to let him keep going just a little longer. A week later I drove back to the lake house. Not to confront anyone. I simply needed to collect a second set of documents from the hallway desk. Copies of the original trust filing I hadn't taken the first time. I parked down the road and walked up to the side gate. Nathan's car wasn't in the driveway. Madison's small silver car sat alone near the porch. I let myself in through the back entrance using a spare key Nathan had never known I kept. The house was quiet except for Madison's voice from the living room. She was on the phone, relaxed and confident, unaware I was there. "Everything is moving exactly how Nathan said it would," she told someone. "Once he finalizes everything with the house, it's done. The soon-to-be ex has no idea what's coming." I stood still in the hallway and listened. She talked about the house like it was already theirs. She mentioned plans for the baby's room. She laughed easily, the laugh of someone who believed she had already won. I collected my documents quietly, slipped out through the side door, and walked to my car without a sound. By the time I reached the main road, I had already texted Patricia. I told her I had heard enough. When I got home that evening, I opened a joint email account Nathan and I had shared for house-related bills. He had clearly forgotten it existed. He was still logged in. What I found made me sit completely still. Over several months, Nathan and Madison had exchanged a long chain of messages about the lake house. Madison hadn't just been waiting for Nathan to handle things. She had been actively guiding him. She suggested steps for moving assets. She recommended he get a separate appraisal without telling me. She had even been the one to bring up the refinancing idea first, writing that if he pulled equity from the house, he would have everything he needed without needing anything from me. She had framed me as an obstacle to be worked around. In another message, Madison told Nathan to list the lake house as a marital asset in any divorce proceedings. She had clearly done research of her own. I forwarded everything to Patricia that same night. Patricia called back within the hour, her voice careful and tight. "Isabella," she said, "if Nathan goes ahead and signs certain documents with that lender, this stops being a civil matter. It becomes something the court treats very differently." I asked her to explain exactly what she meant. Patricia explained that if Nathan signed refinancing documents claiming legal ownership of the lake house, he would be committing fraud against the lender. He would be presenting himself as the owner of a property he had no legal right to touch. That wasn't just a divorce problem, that was a criminal one. She strongly advised me to step in and stop the meeting. I told her I had a different idea. Instead of warning the lender to cancel, I asked Patricia to send the full trust documentation directly to the lender's legal team, quietly, before the meeting took place. Not to stop it from happening, but to make sure the right people in that room already knew the truth before Nathan opened his mouth. Patricia went quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You want him to walk in and trap himself." "I want the facts on the table," I said calmly. "I'm not hiding anything. I'm just making sure the truth arrives before he does." She was silent again, then said she would handle it. I hung up and thought about how confident Nathan had sounded on that couch next to Madison's baby things, telling me to be mature about the situation. He had no idea the table had already been set. Alan let me know when the refinancing meeting was scheduled. It was a Tuesday morning at a mid-sized lending office downtown. Nathan arrived in a good suit carrying a folder of documents. According to Alan, he walked in looking completely at ease. The meeting started normally. The loan officer was professional and polite. He asked standard questions about the property, its history, and the ownership structure. Then he asked about the trust. Nathan's easy expression shifted. He looked at the document the loan officer slid across the table, A copy of the full trust agreement Patricia had already submitted. Nathan picked it up slowly, the way someone picks something up when they suddenly realize they are in trouble. Can you walk us through the trust ownership structure? The loan officer asked, still polite but with a careful edge underneath. Nathan didn't answer right away. He flipped through several pages. His jaw tightened. He had never read the trust agreement. Not once in 12 years. He had sat beside me at the attorney's table, signing pages he never looked at, assuming everything was shared the way he assumed everything was his. The loan officer waited calmly. Nathan had no answer to give him. I wasn't in that room. But when Alan described Nathan's face in that moment, I finally allowed myself a small, quiet breath. Nathan came home that afternoon angrier than I had ever seen him. He slammed the front door and appeared in the kitchen doorway still in his suit, face flushed and tight. You did this, he said. You sent them those papers. I looked up from where I was making tea. I made sure the lender had accurate information about a property they were being asked to lend against, I said. That seemed fair. You've been hiding financial information from me our entire marriage, he snapped. You signed every document placed in front of you, I replied, keeping my voice level. The information was never hidden. You simply didn't read it. He stared at me, breathing hard. He was searching for the version of this story where he was the victim, but he couldn't quite find it. Stop whatever you're planning, he said. I picked up my mug and looked at him steadily. Nathan, I said quietly, you should stop living at the lake house. Immediately. Before things become much more complicated. He laughed. A short, dismissive sound. I'm not going anywhere, he said. I didn't respond. I simply turned back toward the counter. He had no idea what was already in motion. 3 days later, Nathan received an official legal notice at the lake house address. It stated clearly that he and any current occupants were required to vacate the property within 7 days. The notice came from Patricia's firm on behalf of the family trust. It outlined the infidelity clause in plain, direct language and confirmed that Nathan's presence, along with Madison's, was a direct violation of the trust conditions. The notice carried full legal authority. This was not a personal request from me. This was a formal action backed by the trust documentation and weeks of collected evidence. Nathan called within the hour, voice strained and tight. This is a bluff, he said. You can't actually enforce this. I can, I said. Patricia can explain the process if you'd like. You're doing this to punish me, he said. I'm doing this because it's legally correct, I replied. He went quiet. Then I heard him say, almost to himself, she won't actually go through with it. I didn't argue. I simply told him the 7-day clock had already started and ended the call. He thought I was bluffing. I knew that. And I also knew he would find out very soon that I wasn't. Nathan didn't leave. On the 6th day, I received word through Patricia that he had filed a legal challenge in family court. His argument was straightforward. He claimed the lake house was marital property. He said that regardless of the trust structure, the home had been used as a shared family asset throughout our marriage, and I was using legal technicalities to push him out of a property he had an equal right to claim. His lawyer, a young man from a corporate firm with limited family law experience, filed the papers quickly and confidently. Nathan was betting a judge would look at 12 years of shared life in that house and decide it counted for something. I understood the logic. On the surface it almost sounded reasonable. But Patricia wasn't worried. She told me to let the process move forward. The moment Nathan's challenge was filed, the court would request the full original trust records. Once they reviewed those records, every page, every clause, every signature, Nathan's argument was going to fall apart in a way he hadn't prepared for. Let him file, Patricia said calmly. He just handed us exactly what we need. I told her I was ready. The court records review took 9 days. During that time, Nathan was apparently confident. He told mutual friends he expected the judge to rule in his favor, that the trust structure was merely a formality and any fair court would recognize the house as a shared marital asset. What he had forgotten, or truly never understood, was the prenuptial agreement we had signed before our wedding. Nathan had insisted on that prenup. His family pushed for it because he had recently inherited money. I signed without complaint. But the prenup contained a clause, written plainly in Section 9, that specifically excluded any property owned through my family trust from all marital claims. That clause had no expiration date. The family trust and the prenup were linked. Together they formed a legal wall around the lake house that Nathan could not climb over. Not in any court, under any argument. When the court reviewed the full records and connected the prenup to the trust documentation, the outcome became clear very quickly. Patricia called me the morning after the review was submitted. "He has no claim," she said simply. I already knew. But hearing it said out loud felt like a window opening in a room that had been sealed for a very long time. While Nathan was dealing with the legal fallout downtown, things at the lake house were not going smoothly between him and Madison. Alan had a contact who lived near the property, and through careful updates, I began to understand that the easy confidence Madison had shown during that phone call was starting to crack. She had believed Nathan was a man of means. He had presented himself that way. Steady income, vacation property, solid savings, a comfortable future for her and the baby. She had trusted him because he had seemed so certain of everything. But the legal challenge Nathan filed was not free. Attorney fees were eating through money fast. And the frozen joint accounts, which Patricia had moved to restrict as part of the divorce proceedings I was quietly preparing, meant Nathan's available funds were much tighter than Madison had realized. She started asking questions Nathan couldn't answer smoothly. She asked about the bank accounts. She asked what would happen if the court ruled against him. She asked about the debt. Nathan apparently told her not to worry, that everything was under control. But I knew from everything Alan had shared that almost nothing was under control anymore. Madison was beginning to see that too. Alan confirmed what I had already suspected when he called on a Thursday afternoon. Madison had discovered the debt. Nathan had not only been pulling money from our joint savings to fund his relationship with her. He had also quietly taken out a personal line of credit nearly 18 months ago, using it to cover costs he couldn't pull from shared accounts without raising flags. Restaurant bills, weekend trips, a piece of jewelry Madison had believed was a generous, easy gift. The line of credit was nearly maxed out. Between that debt, the restricted joint accounts, and the growing legal fees, Nathan's actual financial picture was far darker than the life he had been showing Madison. Alan told me she had found a credit statement left on the kitchen counter at the lake house. She hadn't said much in the moment, but she went very quiet. Later that same afternoon, she made a long phone call to her mother. I didn't feel triumphant hearing any of this. I felt a specific kind of tiredness, the kind that comes from finally understanding how long a lie had been running and how many people it had quietly damaged. Nathan had made promises he had no ability to keep. And Madison was only now beginning to understand what she had walked into. The court date was set for a Wednesday morning. I arrived early with Patricia and took a seat at the table on the left side of the room. Nathan came in a few minutes later with his young attorney. He looked thinner than the last time I had seen him up close. He didn't look at me when he sat down. The judge was careful and experienced. She reviewed the documents thoroughly before the session formally began, moving through the pages without rushing, making small quiet notes as she went. Patricia presented the trust records, the prenuptial agreement, and the infidelity evidence in a clean, organized sequence. She didn't dramatize anything. She laid the facts out in order and let the documents speak for themselves. Nathan's attorney argued the house had functioned as a shared marital asset in practice, and that the trust clause was being applied selectively. He was articulate and professional, but he was working with very little. The judge listened to both sides without expression. She asked Patricia 2 brief questions about the prenuptial clause. She asked Nathan's lawyer 1 question about the timeline. Then she removed her reading glasses and set them down on the desk. The room went very quiet. The judge delivered her ruling without delay. She confirmed that the lake house was held inside a protected family trust and had been clearly excluded from marital property by the terms of the prenuptial agreement. She acknowledged the infidelity clause and noted that the evidence of marital misconduct was thorough, well-organized, and consistent with the trust conditions. Nathan's legal challenge was dismissed. She ordered that Nathan and Madison vacate the property within 48 hours. Any failure to do so would result in law enforcement carrying out a formal removal. There would be no further extensions. Nathan's lawyer leaned over and spoke quietly in his ear. Nathan sat very still, hands flat on the table. He didn't argue. There was nothing left to argue with. Patricia gathered her files calmly. I thanked her in a low voice and stood. As I turned toward the exit, I heard Nathan's chair push back. He called my name from across the room. I paused for one breath. Then I kept walking. That evening my phone buzzed with a call from Nathan. Then another. Then a third. I let them all go to voicemail. I was sitting on the small balcony of my city apartment, watching the sky shift from orange to deep blue. For the first time in a long while, I felt something close to steady. On the second evening after the ruling, Nathan called again. This time I answered. His voice was different. The anger was completely gone. What remained sounded exhausted and desperate in a way that was honestly harder to hear than the anger had been. Bella, he said quietly, please, just hear me out. I told him I was listening. He said he had made terrible mistakes. He said he understood that now. He said whatever had happened between him and Madison, there was a baby involved, an innocent child. He wanted more time at the property, just until Madison had somewhere safe to go. I listened to all of it without interrupting. Then I spoke quietly. Nathan, I said, I know about the joint accounts. I know exactly how much you moved and over how long. I know about the credit line. I have records of all of it, and my attorney is already building the financial portion of the divorce case. Silence. The 48 hours stands, I continued. I'm not saying this out of anger. I'm saying it because it's what the court decided and because it's correct. He didn't respond for a long moment. Then, barely above a whisper, he said, I didn't think you were paying attention. I know, I said. That was your biggest mistake. 2 days after that phone call, I officially filed for divorce. Patricia had already prepared the paperwork. Alongside the standard divorce filing, she submitted a detailed financial document outlining every transfer Nathan had made from our joint accounts over the past 26 months. The total was just over $40,000 pulled quietly from shared savings to fund a life I had known nothing about. There was also the personal line of credit. And there were records of the refinancing attempt, which Patricia characterized as an attempt to commit fraud against a lending institution using a property Nathan had no right to leverage. The court moved quickly. Within 24 hours of the filing, the judge issued an order freezing all remaining joint assets pending a full financial investigation. Nathan's access to our shared accounts was immediately restricted. He could not move money, close accounts, or make any transfers until the investigation was complete. I received a short message from Patricia that afternoon. Freeze confirmed. Assets secured. I sat at my kitchen table and exhaled slowly. Nathan's plan had been to walk away with the lake house, a new partner, and a comfortable financial cushion. Instead, he was now facing a divorce investigation, frozen accounts, and a court order he could not appeal. Every move he had made had circled quietly back to him. Alan called me on a Friday morning with the news I had been expecting. Madison had left the lake house. She hadn't gone dramatically. She had simply packed her bags over 2 days and driven to her parents' home about 3 hours away. A neighbor confirmed seeing her load the last of her things into her car early that morning. She had sent Nathan a message before leaving. Alan didn't have the exact words, but the meaning was clear. She had not signed up for this. She had believed Nathan was stable and established. She had trusted his version of things completely. Now she was looking at a man tangled in legal proceedings, financial investigations, and frozen accounts, weeks away from delivering a baby. She was not willing to bring a child into that situation. She was gone. Nathan was now alone at the lake house he was about to be legally removed from, with no partner, no financial cushion, and no plan that still held together. I didn't feel victorious. I felt a quiet, deep sadness for the child who would be born into all of this wreckage. But I also knew none of this had been my doing. Nathan had built this situation piece by careful piece, entirely by himself. Word travels fast in a small professional community, and Nathan had never been careful about keeping his private life separate from his work. Within 2 weeks of the court hearing and the divorce filing, people were talking. The story that attracted the most attention wasn't the affair itself. Affairs were not unusual enough to shock anyone. What people found astonishing was the refinancing attempt. The idea that Nathan had walked into a lender's office and tried to pull equity from a property, he had never legally owned was the detail that kept spreading. It made people shake their heads, not just because it was dishonest but because it was so reckless and so easily avoidable. Two colleagues Nathan had worked alongside for years quietly distanced themselves. A business contact developing a joint project with him withdrew without giving a formal reason. Nathan had always been good at presenting a certain image. Confident, steady, a man with things under control. That image was gone now. What remained was a far less flattering picture. A man who had made large, careless decisions and assumed no one would ever look closely enough to notice. People had looked. The record was clear. And reputation once lost is not easily rebuilt. The divorce settlement hearing took place on a gray autumn morning 6 weeks after the financial investigation concluded. The prenuptial agreement held in its entirety. The judge found no grounds to override any of its terms. Every property connected to my family trust, including the lake house, was fully mine. Nathan had no legal claim to any of it. The frozen joint accounts were divided according to the financial evidence Patricia had submitted. Because Nathan had been proven to have systematically misused shared funds over nearly 2 years, his share was significantly reduced. His personal account, built through those slow, quiet transfers, was subject to partial recovery claims based on funds traced back to our joint savings. When everything was totaled, Nathan walked away with a small fraction of what he had imagined when he first started planning his new life. His mounting attorney fees had consumed much of what remained. He signed the final documents without looking at me. I signed mine calmly and set the pen down. Patricia shook my hand outside the courtroom. "It's done," she said. I nodded. I stood in the corridor for a quiet moment, breathing ordinary air on an ordinary morning. It was done. I didn't go back to the lake house right away. I gave myself 2 full months. When I finally drove up the familiar road through the trees, I wasn't sure how I would feel. The last time I had truly been there, Madison had been standing in the doorway wearing my robe. But as I turned into the driveway and the house came into view, sitting quietly at the edge of the water in the late afternoon light, something inside me shifted. Just looked like a house. My house. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The furniture was in place. Nathan had taken very little. My grandmother's coffee table sat where it always had. The anniversary painting was still on the wall. The hallway desk drawer was closed. I walked slowly through each room. The baby supplies were gone. The suitcases Nathan kept near the back closet were gone. The visible traces of everything that had happened here had been cleared away. What remained was the house itself, the worn wooden floors, the big windows facing the water, the smell of pine and old wood that had always made this place feel like somewhere you could breathe freely. I sat down on the couch and let the quiet settle over me. Felt like mine again. Because it always had been. Through Patricia and a few mutual connections, I received scattered updates about Nathan in the months that followed. His business had been quietly struggling for over a year before the divorce. Without the financial stability our shared household had provided, it contracted quickly. He let 2 employees go and moved out of his rental apartment into a much smaller place on the edge of town. Madison had delivered the baby, a girl I was told, and was raising her at her parents' home with their full support. As far as anyone knew, Nathan's involvement was limited. The ongoing financial complications of the divorce made consistent support very difficult. The confident version of Nathan that he had spent years carefully building, the successful man with a vacation property, a growing business and a future full of easy choices, was no longer recognizable in the life he was actually living. I didn't share any of this with anyone. It wasn't something I felt satisfaction in knowing. I had never wanted Nathan to suffer. I had simply refused to let him take things from me that were never his to take. There is a clear difference between those two things. I had spent a long time making sure I understood it. Several months after the divorce was finalized, I spent a quiet weekend at the lake house alone. On the last evening I carried a blanket out to the deck and settled into my favorite old wooden chair. The sun was setting across the water, coloring the lake in shades of orange and pink. A light wind moved through the trees along the bank. I thought about my grandmother, who had insisted on the trust when I was young enough to think careful planning was something only old people needed. I thought about how little I had understood then, about knowing exactly what was yours and protecting it. I thought about the morning I arrived to find the front door open and a stranger wearing my robe in my doorway. I thought about walking back out quietly, knowing something Nathan didn't. The house he had tried to give away became the very place where I found my footing again. He had handed over something he never owned. In doing so, he had shown me, clearly and finally, exactly the kind of man he had always been. I pulled the blanket tighter and watched the last light fade over the water. And the man who thought he could replace me in my own home ended up proving exactly why he never belonged there in the first place.